Most people think medieval knights trained the way movies show it: slow sword swings, clean armor, and dramatic duels. But the real training of English knights was far tougher, far more exhausting, and nothing like the romantic fantasy. Their routines were closer to modern military conditioning, mixed with brutal full-contact drills, relentless horseback work, and weapon practice designed to break the weak. To understand how these warriors survived real medieval battles, you have to see what their training actually looked like. Number 1. The reality behind knightly training. Most people imagine medieval knights learning to fight by casually swinging swords in open fields, like in Hollywood scenes where everything looks clean, dramatic, and slow enough for the audience to follow. But real English knights in the Middle Ages trained with a level of intensity that would surprise most modern athletes, because nothing about their preparation was theatrical. Training started early, long before a boy even understood the responsibilities waiting for him. At around 7 years old, he would be sent to a noble household as a page, stepping into an environment where every corner reminded him he was being shaped for war. The tasks he performed didn't look like combat lessons, yet every chore had a purpose. Running up stone staircases to deliver messages, hauling heavy metal vessels across long halls, carrying equipment from room to room. These things built strength and stamina in ways that felt natural rather than forced. Even serving meals helped develop balance, dexterity, and obedience. It was physical training disguised as daily life. Pages were constantly on the move, which helped their bodies grow strong before formal combat drills even began. And because nobles wanted dependable warriors, the work became tougher as boys grew older. A page might be ordered to run alongside horses, hold shields for extended periods, or carry the gear of older squires. None of this was punishment. It was early strength conditioning. By the time a page transitioned into a squire, he had years of quiet training behind him, and a body that could already handle long days of physical strain. This foundation mattered because armored combat demanded an extreme level of fitness that movies rarely show. 50 or 60 pounds of armor wasn't something you just put on. You had to earn the stamina to move and fight in it. Real training pushed boys to exhaustion long before they ever faced an enemy. They practiced with weighted weapons, not because it made them look impressive, but because it made fighting with real blades feel easier. Wooden swords and wasters were deliberately heavier, shields were thicker, and armor for training was often bulkier. Hollywood sword fights focus on perfect form and dramatic sweeps, but real medieval combat was more like controlled chaos fast, brutal, and physically overwhelming. Knights drilled strikes, grapples, shield bashes, and quick bursts of aggression for hours until the movements became instinct. There was no stopping to readjust or catch a breath. The goal was to keep going, even when tired, because real battles punished hesitation. Outside drills, English knights kept themselves ready through everyday activities that doubled as conditioning. Hunting wasn't a noble pastime. It was endurance and tracking practice. Running through forests, climbing uneven slopes, and chasing game for hours built lung capacity and leg strength. Wrestling with other squires sharpened their ability to fight in armor, and even games like mock battles or wall climbing taught footwork, grip, and agility. Essentially, an English household raising future knights functioned like a year-round training camp. Nothing was wasted. Every movement built towards surviving the realities of medieval warfare. Number 2. How squires actually learned to fight. When a boy reached his teenage years and became a squire, the real transformation began. This stage determined whether he would advance to knighthood or remain a lifelong retainer. Hollywood often portrays squires as simple assistants, polishing armor or handing over swords. Yes, they did those things, but those tasks were barely 1% of their training. A squire was expected to develop into a full combat-capable warrior, and that meant learning every technical detail of his equipment. Knowing how to maintain armor wasn't optional. Squires repaired straps, replaced broken rivets, learned to spot weak points, and studied how metal reacted to hits. This hands-on knowledge taught them not only how to protect themselves, but also how to exploit flaws in an enemy's defense. Archery was another important part of training, even though English knights didn't typically fight as archers. Drawing a longbow required immense strength, so much so that skeletons of medieval archers show warped spines and enlarged arm bones. Training with bows, even casually, built the kind of upper body power necessary to swing a sword or lance repeatedly in armor. On top of this came constant riding practice. Controlling a warhorse wasn't a simple matter of sitting in a saddle. A knight had to steer the horse with his legs, while keeping both hands free for weapons. Squires spent years riding through obstacle courses, practicing sharp turns, sudden stops, and mock charges. Falling off was expected. In fact, falling and recovering quickly was part of the training, because a knight on the ground during battle was suddenly vulnerable. Then came direct combat instruction. Squires trained in wrestling and grappling techniques specifically designed for armored fighting, not sports. These included throws, joint locks, leverage tactics, and methods to twist or trip an opponent wearing heavy gear. They used blunted weapons during practice, but the strikes were full force. Instructors expected them to hit hard, block hard, and keep moving despite exhaustion. Many drills involved striking posts hundreds of times, learning how to deliver blows accurately without losing balance. Others focused on shield work bashing, deflecting, and trapping. Medieval shields weren't static props, they were active weapons. Movies loved to show sword fights as elegant dances, where two fighters exchange blows cleanly. Real training was much more aggressive. Squires learned to fight dirty, because enemies on a battlefield didn't follow rules. They practiced hooking ankles, pushing opponents into walls, or using the pommel or crossguard of a sword as striking tools. They sparred in groups so they could learn how to move when surrounded. And because wars in medieval England weren't constant, they relied heavily on repetition to stay sharp, drilling until these rough techniques became automatic. By late adolescence, squires accompanied knights on minor campaigns or escort missions. These early experiences exposed them to real violence and battlefield pressure. They learned how formations worked, how quickly lines could break, and how terrifying the chaos of battle felt. This experience shaped their instincts, preparing them to survive cavalry clashes, shield wall engagements, and sieges. By the time a squire was ready to be knighted, usually in his early 20s, he was already a hardened fighter. Number 3. Weapons training that Hollywood never shows. Real medieval training in England focused far less on swords than movies suggest. The sword wasn't a knight's main weapon. It was more like a reliable backup for close quarters emergencies. The spear, lance, and poleaxe were the real tools of the battlefield, so knights spent far more time mastering those. Spears were essential because they gave reach and precision. Knights trained in long formations, standing shoulder to shoulder, and drilling coordinated thrusts. This kind of training built discipline and teamwork, teaching fighters how to maintain distance and protect the man next to them. It wasn't the glamorous one-on-one dueling Hollywood loves. It was practical group combat meant to keep you alive. The lance demanded an entirely different kind of expertise. Charging at high speed with a 12-foot lance tucked under your arm required perfect coordination between rider and horse. Knights practiced by aiming at suspended rings, rotating targets, or shield posts to improve their accuracy. A small mistake, angling the lance too high, bracing too late, or losing balance could cause serious injury. The force of impact during a charge was massive. Absorbing that shock without falling took months of conditioning. And training didn't stop once a knight could hit a target. They practiced lowering the lance smoothly, recovering after impact, and transitioning to a sword or mace if the weapon shattered. The poleaxe was one of the most feared weapons of the late medieval period. Part axe, part hammer, part spear, it could crush armor, pierce helmets, or sweep an opponent's legs. Poleaxe training was brutal because armored combat became a hybrid of wrestling and striking. Knights practiced hooking opponents behind the knee with the axe side, dragging them off balance, or delivering hammer blows to helmets to stun them. The goal was to break the opponent's posture, not just land pretty hits. Training sessions often ended with fighters gasping for air because the weapon was heavy, and the movements demanded constant footwork and strength. Dagger combat was another area movies almost never portray accurately. Medieval daggers weren't for dramatic slashing. They were designed for piercing armor gaps. Knights trained to use daggers at extremely close range, focusing on wrist control, leverage, and breaking holds. Many dagger drills resembled a mix of grappling and quick thrusts aimed at vulnerable spots like the armpit, palm, or visor slit. Shields, too, were weapons. Knights practiced striking with the shield's edge, using it to trap an opponent's arm, or smashing forward to break their stance. Real knights didn't fight in clean, choreographed exchanges. They trained to move non-stop, adapt quickly, and stay aggressive even while exhausted. Their weapon sessions blended striking, grappling, footwork, and endurance training into a single continuous flow. And unlike movies where fighters pause dramatically, real knights learned that stopping meant losing. Every drill pushed them to keep going, even when their muscles burned and their vision blurred. That relentless approach built the instinctive reactions needed to survive the brutal chaos of medieval warfare. Number 4. Horseback combat training beyond the fantasy. People imagine medieval knights gliding into battle on perfectly obedient horses. But cavalry combat in England during the Middle Ages was built on an entirely different level of discipline and danger. Knights depended on destriers' huge, muscular warhorses trained for aggression, noise, and impact. These weren't gentle parade animals. They were living weapons, and learning to control one took years of relentless practice. Squires started by riding bareback on smaller horses, getting used to the unpredictable bounce and sway long before they ever touched armor. Riding without a saddle forced them to develop a natural sense of balance, the kind you can't fake with good posture. Instructors pushed them to ride across uneven hills, through mud, or around tight corners, because real battlefields were never flat or ideal. Once they showed basic competence, the drills became more demanding. They practiced guiding a horse using only their legs and hips, because in real combat, their hands would be holding a lance, shield, or weapon. This meant learning how to tighten muscles, shift weight, and anticipate sudden movements. A warhorse spooked easily from flashing steel or loud shouting, so squires trained around constant noise-clashing shields, barking orders, and mock screams, to teach the horse and rider that chaos was normal. Carrying heavy shields or weapons while riding was another skill entirely. A large heater shield created wind resistance that pulled the rider's body sideways, so squires spent hours correcting their posture mid-gallop. They learned to pick up objects from the ground without dismounting, a deceptively hard task that tested balance and leg strength. Everything was about building instincts that kept them alive later. Then came the lance drills, something Hollywood barely understands. A real couched lance charge was violent and incredibly risky. Knights had to lower the lance at the perfect moment, lock it under the arm, and stare down a target while the horse sprinted at full speed. If the angle was wrong, or the timing off, the force could rip the lance from their grip or unseat them instantly. They practiced striking spinning targets like quintons or rings dangling from ropes, forcing them to refine accuracy while the horse moved unpredictably beneath them. And unlike movie scenes where a lone rider charges heroically, medieval knights trained to ride shoulder to shoulder in tight formation. They learned to match speed, align their lances, and brace for impact as a united wall of force. After the initial collision, they were expected to transition immediately to another weapon, usually a sword, mace, or axe. Switching weapons while mounted wasn't a flashy move, it was survival. They drilled it over and over until muscle memory took over. Knights also used their horses offensively, pushing through infantry lines or knocking enemies aside with the destrier's chest and weight. Controlling a panicked warhorse in close quarters required the rider to stay calm, while thousands of pounds of muscle reacted to danger around it. Training for mounted combat wasn't pretty or romantic. It was sweaty, loud, painful, and exhausting, but it formed the backbone of medieval English warfare. Number 5. Daily conditioning and brutal physical routines. Movies never show the hours of physical conditioning knights endured just to be functional fighters. Real medieval combat required enough stamina to fight, recover, and fight again while wearing 50 to 60 pounds of armor. Knights had to treat their bodies like high-performance machines, long before that idea even existed. Their day didn't start with weapon drills. It often began with raw conditioning. Running miles across uneven terrain, sprinting uphill, climbing stone staircases, wrestling on dirt floors. This was normal, not exceptional. They trained their legs heavily because armored combat depended on stance and mobility far more than Hollywood suggests. The ability to pivot, brace, or lunge while carrying extra weight separated skilled fighters from dead ones. Knights also trained in full armor regularly, something movies almost never show. Well-fitted armor allowed more movement than people assume, but only if the fighter was conditioned to handle the weight. Training sessions pushed their cardiovascular limits, teaching them to breathe correctly, even when the chest plate compressed their lungs. They practiced climbing ladders with shields strapped to their backs, rolling across the ground, crouching behind cover, or pushing through narrow spaces. These weren't heroic set pieces. They were basic survival drills. One common tool was the simple wooden post that knights struck repeatedly with swords or axes. They practiced thousands of swings a day, building endurance and perfecting angles. The repetitive strikes strengthened their grip, wrists, and shoulders far more effectively than any gym routine. Pell training also reinforced the brutal reality that armored combat wasn't elegant. It was about delivering force consistently without tiring out. Another classic training tool was the quintaina rotating arm, with a shield on one side and a weighted bag on the other. When struck, it spun violently, and a rider who didn't move fast enough could get slammed off his horse. It taught precision, timing, and situational awareness at the same time. Wrestling was arguably the knight's most important physical discipline. Medieval England treated grappling as a core battlefield skill, because armored fights often collapsed into close-quarters struggles. Knights trained throws, sweeps, and holds designed specifically for armor. They practiced breaking grips, trapping limbs, and turning an opponent's weight against him. They learned how to fall safely, how to get up quickly, and how to continue fighting after hitting the ground. These routines toughened their bodies as much as their minds. They lived with soreness, bruising, and exhaustion as normal parts of training. Their strength didn't come from polished choreography. It came from raw repetition, discomfort, and an unending cycle of conditioning that movies never capture. Number 6. Realistic combat psychology and battlefield awareness. The mental side of medieval combat training is almost always ignored in movies, yet it was one of the most important areas of preparation for English knights. Being physically strong meant nothing if fear or confusion took control in the middle of a chaotic battle. So training focused heavily on developing emotional resilience, sharp instincts, and battlefield awareness. Squires learned from a young age that fear was normal but had to be managed. Instructors created controlled chaos during drills, smashing weapons against shields, shouting conflicting orders, or simulating surprise attacks. These weren't theatrical moments. They were designed to push a trainee's stress threshold. The goal was to teach future knights how to keep breathing steadily, think under pressure, and recognize threats without panicking. They practiced holding formation even when adrenaline surged or when visibility dropped because of dust, fog, or smoke. Listening for commands in a chaotic environment was another crucial skill. Knights had to hear horns, shouted orders, or signals over the noise of clashing weapons and screaming men. Losing awareness for even a moment could break a formation and open gaps for the enemy. That's why scenario drills were common. Squires practiced defending narrow bridges, responding to ambushes, repositioning during shield wall breaks, or reinforcing collapsing lines. These exercises taught adaptability and discipline at the same time. They learned when to push forward, when to hold, and when to fall back, because retreating in a controlled way was often more important than advancing. Mental endurance mattered as much as physical endurance. Real battles could last hours, and knights had to remain focused after fatigue set in. They trained to keep fighting even when their arms burned, their legs shook, or their vision blurred with sweat. They also trained to shut out distraction stray sounds, fallen allies, or unexpected movements. Their awareness had to remain fixed on immediate threats and commands. Another overlooked part of mental training involved learning from veterans. Knights and older soldiers retold past battles in vivid detail: what worked, what failed, and how fast a situation could turn deadly. These stories weren't told for entertainment. They acted as living textbooks that shaped a young fighter's understanding of terrain, weather, timing, and human behavior in war. Knights weren't trained as lone heroes, despite how movies portray them. Their psychology was built around trust in their commander, trust in their formation, and trust in the fighters beside them. A reckless or panicked knight could break ranks and doom the entire unit. Discipline wasn't optional, it was the foundation of survival. Their mental training shaped them into warriors capable of functioning under extreme noise, fear, and exhaustion. The real psychological preparation of medieval knights was far more practical, raw, and demanding than the romanticized image Hollywood usually presents.